you're not normally hearing them in the way that they're typically recorded. Like drums are typically recorded sort of isolated from, like each drum isolated from the other somewhat, by having close mics on top of them. And it's kind of an artificial way to listen to the drums. If you play the drums, I have as an archetype for almost any sound what it sounds like to the person playing the instrument, right? So if you're playing an acoustic guitar, the ideal would be for it to sound like you were sitting there with the guitar in your lap playing it. That's the ideal in my mind. Or at the very least, that's a good place to start. Because presumably the person playing the drums or the guitar or the piano or whatever is doing it in a way that's like suits him, you know? So I like to have the drums in the stereo spectrum reflect what the drummer would be hearing. So, for example, having a hi-hat on the left or then a floor tom on the right, if you're dealing with a right-handed drummer. The stuff that the drummer hears on the left coming out of the left speaker, the stuff that the drummer hears on the right coming out of the right speaker. That's one way of making it sound more normal to me. It always sounds weird to me if you hear a piano, like, especially like a glissando on the piano, and it starts on the wrong side, you know? When you're sitting at the piano, the low end is on the left and the high end is on the right. And when I hear a stereo recording of a piano and it sort of swirls in a like a circle or something like that, it always sounds crazy to me. Like, well, they just did that. That's a trick, you know? So it kind of fits in with my aesthetic of trying to make things sound sort of the way they do to the person who performed it. And when you're listening to a drum kit while you're playing it, you're listening to it from some distance. Not, you know, your head isn't resting next to the head. Your ear isn't resting next to the drum head. So I generally have the mics for the drums slightly farther away from the drums than most people do when they're close micing. Or most of the time, like in a club environment or something where you're worried about stage noise, you have to have the mics very close to the drums to prevent bleeding and that sort of stuff. But in a studio environment, you can back the mics off a little bit without it causing too much trouble.
Can I be really rude?
Sure.
You know what you want to understand?
C42. The Josephson C42 drums than you would in a normal close micing situation. Like, I don't know if you can see this rack tom mic here. Ordinarily, I would have a mic like that positioned, I don't know, 4 to 6 inches away from the head, maybe a bit more, and generally try to put it in a place where it's not going to interfere with the drummer. That looks about right to me. I'd have to listen to it to make sure, but the key is that the microphone, the active part of the microphone, is facing down toward the drum, sort of in the contact area. And as much as I can, I'd like to try to approximate the parallel surface of the drum head with the diaphragm, mic diaphragm. The reason being that there's a big planar movement of that drum head, and I don't want that wave to be moving obliquely across the diaphragm. I want it to be moving the diaphragm like a piston, so that you have as little phase change across the surface of the diaphragm as you can get away with. Now for the bottom mic here, the bottom mic, you don't have to worry about the drummer playing the bottom of the drum, at least not very often. It happens, but so that mic you can actually very closely approximate what I would consider perfect position, which is the mic nigh on the middle of the drum, beneath it, sort of parallel to the bottom head. So that as the drum is excited, the physics of drums are kind of interesting as well. I've read a little bit about it. I don't know as much about it as fancy pants NASA scientists and stuff. But you would think that when you hit this top head, that the column of air would move the bottom head away from it, and then the whole thing would go back and forth like that, like a spring. It doesn't really happen that way. The whole drum gets excited and sort of resonates in a spherical pattern and behaves almost like a point source. If you imagine, then these are two cardioid microphones, right? and they're pointed in opposite directions. One's pointed down, one's pointed up. And because they're pointed in opposite directions, they're acoustically out of opposite polarities. That is, any sound that this one hears, that this one also hears, they will hear at different polarities because they're facing opposite directions. It's equivalent to the two lobes of a figure-8 microphone. The two lobes of a figure-8 microphone have opposite polarities with each other, and that's why MS stereo recording works using figure-8 microphone to split a single microphone into two virtual microphones. I don't know, did anybody see the MS recording thing that Bob Weston did yesterday?
Yeah.
Show of hands. It was really good. He's got a little circular, he's got a little handout that shows the math of how MS recording works. And a figure-8 microphone is essentially two cardioid microphones operating together as a single system. I mean, you could think of it that way. You can make a fake figure-8 microphone by taking two cardioid microphones and pointing them in opposite directions. And you can even do mid-side recording with such a fake figure-8 microphone if you wanted to. It's kind of an elaborate, that's like a fourth level of abstraction. You know, that's like, it's like that movie about the musical based on the movie of the producers. Like if we did a cartoon of the movie of the musical based on the movie of the producers, it would be that level of abstraction. So anyway, because these mics are pointed in opposite directions and they're acoustically of opposite phases, you need to normalize the polarity of those two microphones if you're going to sum them, that is, if you're going to hear them at the same time. So one of those two needs to have its polarity reversed in order for it to represent the acoustic sound of that drum as it's vibrating. Which of the two you reverse depends on the phase relationship of both of these microphones with all the other microphones in the drum kit. So, as a rule of thumb, you could say you flip the bottom microphone to hear what that drum sounds like through the two microphones. Ultimately, when you have all the mics up live on the drum kit, it's worth it to go through an experiment with flipping the polarity of one or the other to see which one complements the sound of the rest of the drum kit. I wish I could say that it comes out the same way more often. It comes out one way or another more often than not. It's pretty random. Sometimes the top mic you have to reverse the polarity because when you reverse the polarity on the bottom one, it makes the bass drum sound puny. Sometimes you have to do the other way around. Each of the microphones around the drum kit can hear the whole drum kit. So it's a mistake to think of recording the drums as recording individual instruments. It's like, I once referred to the drum kit as the bully's piano. And that's sort of the way I try to record it. If you imagine recording every key of a piano separately with its own microphone to its own track on tape so that you could have control over it later and rebalance it later, that example is patently ridiculous, right? A drum kit isn't that different from a piano. Like, you've got a bunch of resonating systems that are all excited individually, but they can all also be excited by each other. In the same way that when you hit one string on a piano, that string isn't operating in isolation. It's vibrating the soundboard. It's, all the other strings and all the other mechanical parts of the piano are moving. In order for the piano to sound normal, you can't just listen to that string. You have to listen to the whole of the piano. Same with the drum kit. I've been talking a lot. I'm getting kind of winded. All right, so that explains the principle of using two microphones pointed in opposite directions. There's a special case. Well, there are two other sort of somewhat special cases. What I just said sort of applies to all the tom-toms on the drum kit, however many tom-toms there are. This is the perfect number, by the way, 2. I don't know if there's the perfect number of tom-toms for a drum kit is 2. You can have an extra one if there's a special moment in one song where, for example, there's a trick that like you have to bounce a stick off of that one. Any more than 2, and you're venturing into show-off territory. So anyway, the bass drum. There's a secondary effect of having these two microphones pointed in opposite directions, right? Sounds that are coming at them from a distance, they're not acoustically out of polarity with. They're sort of relative to the distant sound. they have the same polarity. This is kind of hard for me to explain because I don't really understand it that well. But if, for example, you have a low-frequency sound source that's some distance away from this drum kit, and you have these two microphones on, facing as they are in opposite directions, and you reverse the polarity of one of them, that large low-frequency wave hitting both of them virtually simultaneously will be attenuated in the sum signal. So this principle is used in a style of microphone called a differoid microphone, where you have two microphones that are relatively close together, and you reverse the polarity of one of them. Sounds that are arriving at that microphone from a distance are canceled. Sounds that are accentuated in one or the other of those microphones are passed as normal audio. That differoid principle is used in announcers' microphones and sports arenas and things like that, where there's high ambient background noise, but you can put the microphone right close to the sound that you want to amplify. STC and I think Cole's Electroacoustics as well make an announcer's microphone that's, if you've ever seen much old British sports broadcasting, uses a single figure-8 microphone that the announcer speaks into the edge of. He speaks into the edge of the ribbon, because the two lobes of the ribbon are hearing the world at opposite polarities, and they cancel out distant sound like the football crowd roaring. But because his mouth is very close to one or the other edge of that ribbon, his voice is amplified somewhat normally, right? So that's the same principle. The differoid principle is that you have two microphones relatively close to each other, pointed in opposite directions, of opposite polarities, and they'll cancel out distant sounds somewhat, okay? The farther the microphones get apart from each other, the less their phase correlation is accurate and the less cancellation you get. So these microphones are relatively far apart. They won't attenuate much distant sound except at very low frequencies. This comes in somewhat handy if there's like bass guitar rumble getting into the drum mics through a closed door or something like that. There will be some small degree of attenuation, a couple of dB, enough to help out, but not enough to, bank on. All right, so that takes care of the tom-tom two microphone scenario. I often use two microphones on a bass drum. That's diagram 2 in your circular. I'll often have a microphone that's pointed at the batter contact area on the batter side of the bass drum. Generally speaking, that microphone will be a different type than the microphone that's on the front side of the bass drum. On the front side of the bass drum, I generally use what would normally be considered a low-frequency microphone, like a D112, an RE20, an M380, a Bayer 88, yada, yada, yada. There are a lot of microphones that tend to be thought of as low-frequency microphones, and I tend to use microphones like that on the resonant head that is the front side of the bass drum. On the batter side, you want a microphone that is accentuating the attack component of the sound, because the reason you put a microphone on the batter side is so that you have some discrete control over the sound of the batter making contact with the drum head. So that's generally a microphone that has more high-frequency response or sharp mid-range sound quality, that sort of thing. So I'm generally using two different types of microphones. Also, with respect to the placement of those mics, the front microphone may sound better a bit farther away. Some people like to stick the microphone right inside the bass drum. I haven't had that much luck with that myself, but some people do that. And some people like to have it backed out a little bit. I think Andy was talking about how he'd like to have the bass drum microphone out a bit from the bass drum. And I think those are perfectly valid considerations. That and the physical size of the bass drum means that there's going to be a pretty great distance physical distance between the two microphones, the one on the batter side and the one on the front side. And because the physical distance equates to time, that is the time it takes sound to travel from one microphone to the other, there will be an unavoidable phase difference between those two microphones. The difference between those two and the phase difference that's unavoidable, and the fact that you're using two different kinds of microphones, means that the nulling, that is the reinforcement that you get from reversing the polarity of one or the other microphones, will not be as complete as it is in the case of a simpler system like a tom-tom, where you've got two of the same microphone relatively close to each other listening to a simple sound. So having said that, it's not critical to reverse the polarity of one of those two microphones. And in some cases, you will prefer it without reversing the polarity of those two microphones. A lot of times, if the batter side microphone is being recorded separately as a separate attack track, for example, you'll end up rolling off a lot of the low frequency information, which is the part of the spectrum where the phase cancellation would occur. So it will then become immaterial whether you reverse the polarity of it or not. You won't noticeably change the sound quality. If you look at example 3 on the circular, that's a vertical, or I mean an overhead, or that's a plan, right? Rather than elevation. You're looking down on something. It's a plan view. Anybody know? Anybody? Okay. So that's a plan view of the drum kit. You can see that there's a bass drum, the proper number of tom-toms, and a snare drum, and a bicycle seat for the drum throne. I like to refer to it as the throne, by the way, because it makes the drummers feel better. The drum throne. Stool has by the way, this is an aside, but there are a lot of drummer jokes that make the rounds in studios and within bands and stuff. The era of the drummer joke has got to be over by now. I'm really not into drummer. Like, generally speaking, if there's a smart guy and 3 dumb guys in the band, the smart guy's the drummer. So like the drummer jokes really have to end. So anyway, if you notice from that drawing here, the batter side microphone on the bass drum is very close to the snare drum. Like, if I have have a batter side microphone here, pointed at the contact area of the bass drum and the batter, it's about the same distance from the bottom of the snare drum as it is from the bass drum. So that microphone is hearing an awful lot of the underside of the snare drum. That can put a lot of extra noise on that track, which will make it difficult for you to use that as a discrete bass drum track. There's a little signal flow thingy here that I explain about how you can use a compressor as an attenuator, an automatic attenuator, to bring the level of that microphone down when the snare drum is being hit. It sounds crazy that you would want to attenuate part of the bass drum when the snare drum is struck, because there are occasions when they're both hit simultaneously and you don't want to lose the batter side, right? In practice, bass drum and snare drum being hit simultaneously happens pretty rarely in most rock music, most pop music. It happens occasionally in AC/DC music, occasionally in disco music. Those are about the 2 examples. That's about it. And but the corollary to that is that the batter side bass drum microphone is not the principal sound that you're hearing. It's generally not the principal bass drum sound in the mix balance. Generally, it's used to add a little bit of attack to the bass drum. And on those moments where it's being overlapped by the snare drum, that additional bit of attack is not getting you anything. The clarity of the bass drum is being obfuscated by the snare drum anyway. So if you use the snare drum signal to attenuate that microphone using a compressor or a gate inductor mode, it cleans that rattle up in all those moments where the snare drum is struck and that microphone would have otherwise been open. But it leaves the natural sound of that microphone. Some people use a gate on the batter side microphone for the same reason, to keep the snare drum noise out of that microphone. I've found that the speed of the response of the gate affects the sound quality of the batter side microphone sometimes. And if it does, instead of gating that microphone, you can, instead of trying to get rid of everything but the bass drum strokes in that microphone, you can just attenuate the snare noise where the snare noise is a problem using the expander. Using the ducker. A lot of compressors have a side chain input that isn't clearly identified as such. There'll be an insert point, or there'll be a B input or something like that. So sometimes you have to experiment if you're in a new studio and you don't know the equipment that well. But for example, almost all DBX compressors, I know the 160s, and I think they're modular ones. The Valley People stuff, Don't think 1176s do. Don't know about distressors. But you sometimes have to sniff around a little to find a compressor that has a sidechain input that will allow you. Generally, any compressor that can be used as a de-esser has a sidechain input as well. Yeah, you can use a gate. A lot of gates have a ducker function where you can key the gate and have it operate in an inverse fashion. You have to be careful about the ratio of the setting of the gate, because high ratios tend to make the disappearance of that microphone sound pretty radical. That's sometimes called chatter. I've got like a minute and a half, is that right?
No, it's 6.
Lord, I've been talking for a half an hour. All right, let's zip to example 4 real quick. I'm going to do this real quickly.
Yeah, no, because I don't think do I have like the ground right now here? I don't think I just use them. You got to set up. You don't want little weird setup stuff.
You know, I think we should probably not even bother with the sound.
I can if you want to just pop one off real fast, but I do need to swap this drive out for him. So
Yeah, I'd say go ahead and swap it out.
Okay, so you're good?
I'm way too fussy to
so
get that
what?
done quickly.
You know, keep going.
All right, example 4. There's a top and bottom microphones on the snare drum. The placement of the bottom microphone has a pretty big effect on the combined sound of the two microphones on the general sound quality of the snare drum. A lot of people think that just putting a mic on the bottom of the snare drum gives you more of the snare sound and that's it. The bottom head is acting very much like the bottom head of a tom-tom is, and it's contributing to the pitch of the drum. It's contributing to the body of the sound. And if there are 2 bottom mic positions diagram. There's position B and position C. Position B is where the diaphragm of the microphone on the bottom is parallel to the bottom head of the drum. And for the same reason that I did it on the tom-tom, you'll get a cleaner note sound from the bottom head that way. You'll still hear the snares and you'll still be able to control the snare or the wire sound somewhat, but there'll be a generally thicker sound out of the bottom mic. And because the diaphragm is parallel to the planar movement of the bottom head, right? If the bottom microphone is angled, that is looking across the bottom head, it's hearing less of the planar movement, and in fact a large portion of that wave misses that microphone entirely, but it's hearing the noise component, that is the multiple rattles of the snare wires on the bottom head, hearing that quite well. So if your reason for using the bottom mic is just to get a little bit more of the snare wires, you probably want to use a flatter angle of attack on that microphone, so that the planar movement of the bottom head sort of glances across that microphone diaphragm, but the noise element is still well within the pickup pattern. And if you are using a bottom microphone in the straight up and down sort of method, the caveat about the opposite polarities also applies in that situation. So one of the two, either the top mic or the bottom mic, will probably need to be reversed in order for the snare drum to sound normal. In the same way that you can use the snare drum signal to duck the batter side of the bass drum microphone whenever the snare drum is being struck, you can use the batter side of the snare drum signal to open an expander on the bottom microphone so that you don't hear constant snare fizzles when the rest of the drum kit is being played. I find that works better than using a gate on the bottom mic, because an expander that is a low ratio device that operates like a gate, say 2-to-1 ratio, 3-to-1 ratio, something like that, tends to track the dynamics of the playing better. So that if there's a snare drum quiet ghost stroke, a bit of the bottom mic is allowed through, and if there's a hard, if he's really twatting it, then it opens up completely and it all comes through. So I tend to use an expander rather than a gate on the bottom snare drum microphone for that reason, so that it follows the playing dynamics of the drummer a little bit better. All right. That's it. You might want to come and look at one way that I put a microphone on the batter side of the bass drum that I'm not doing right now that I could do is take a little tiny microphone, like a lavalier microphone, or one of the small, like the small Avenson microphones, perfect choice for that. They're physically very small microphones, and you can just dangle them down by taping the mic cable to the rim of the bass drum. You can dangle the microphone so that it's very close to the contact area of the bass drum beater and the batter head. The dangle phone is a very, very good application because it avoids having to have any extra hardware around the bass drum pedal. So if the drummer moves per foot. It's not going to run into anything, and it doesn't require any extra setup or anything, just a little gaffer thing. That's very handy. I've used this very tiny microphone that Countryman makes that you can use. Very tiny DPA microphone. I can't remember what it's called, but the microphones that are intended to be hidden. Crown makes a microphone series called the GLM series. All those are very nice little tiny microphones that you can dangle in convenient places around the drum kit. The last tip I didn't put down in the circular. There are two things I wanted to say about with respect to recording the hi-hat. I virtually never need to put a microphone on the hi-hat, partly because I hate the hi-hat, and it's always too loud anyway. There are two things that you can do to make the snare, if you're listening to the snare drum track on its own, or the sound of the drums and the hi-hat is too aggressive in the whole drum kit, there are two things that you can do to attenuate it. If it's not a finished recording and you're going to do another take, throw a big janitor-sized ring of keys in the space between the two hi-hat cymbals. I have this big retarded key ring here with all these jinglers on it, and what happens is that the keys deaden the bottom cymbal slightly, but they jingle a little bit, so it doesn't sound as dead as if you use taste or sand or whatever the hell else other people use. So I strongly recommend keys inside the hi-hat if the hi-hat is too loud. The other thing that you can do is if it's a recorded track that's already been recorded and you can't do anything about the recording, de-essers, that is frequency response de-essers that are normally used to control sibilants and vocals, work quite well to pull hi-hat out of other drum mics, like the rack tom or the snare drum microphone. If the hi-hat is really loud in those discrete channels, rather than gating those channels, which can make the drums themselves sound funny, you can try inserting a de-esser on those tracks and tune the frequency response of the de-esser until it's just affecting the hi-hat cymbals. When I first tried it, I didn't actually think it would work. It was kind of a flyer. I was pretty desperate. I didn't think it would work, because I assumed that it would take away the attack of the snare drum or the snare fizzle or that sort of thing. But it works a treat if you can tune it in correctly, and you can actually use a de-esser on quite a few microphones on the kit if you need to, if you have a bunch of them. And it doesn't make it sound as weird as you would think it does. So, that's it.
We'll just have to watch. Oh, but we ask that you guys don't touch them, actually.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to be so.
It's our rule.
Yeah.
Not our rule.
Yeah.
The micro, people on microphones.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Right, we're on that really
Quick look at that.
schedule here. Right, we're getting maximum. You guys are